All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second ACU seminar. My name is Shannon Cook, Vice President here at ACE Software. Today, you'll be hearing from Jeremy Sanchez, one of the main developers on the core ACE product. Also joining us today is Brian Bull, Director of Product Development. A few more details, this webinar is being recorded, and after this meeting, we will send you a link so that you can download the recording. All participants are muted, but if you'd like to ask a question about what you see, please do so at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters, Jeremy and Brian. You can jump in and share screens when you're ready.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Shannon. This week I've got two disclaimers. The first is our usual, if you do have any questions, go ahead and make them client agnostic. We're recording the call. We might share it with other people, and we don't want any client confidential information to be accidentally disclosed. So do try to keep it client agnostic if you can, if you've got any questions. The second is that you might notice that my background is different. I'm on site at a client this week. And so if I might get distracted or something, that's it. But I was actually down at their warehouse earlier this morning working on some inventory, and I was thinking to myself, what if I just did the webinar there? And that would be kind of cool, but it was just a little bit too loud. So I popped back to the office so that we could have a little quietness. But if I do get distracted or if I do have to bounce, then that's why. But I'm pretty confident I can stick around. So with that, Jeremy, do you want to go ahead and take it away?
Yeah, I'll take care. I'll take over and share my screen here. Okay, can you see my screen?
I can.
Cool. So just sort of the quick recap. Last week, in the previous webinar, we were talking about the schema side of ACE. Specifically, we were looking at the field names, the conventions that we have for those, a lot of explaining the purposes of a lot of the common fields that exist across many of ACE's tables. We also looked at the relationship graph and how we design and name our table occurrences and relationships. And now for today's webinar, I'd like to go into sort of the introduction to scripting in ACE and cover a lot of the prerequisite knowledge that'll be very helpful for getting into scripting. So let me get started by jumping into the scripts file. I'll open the scripts workspace here. And just like I was saying last week, companies is a pretty good module to work with. It's one of the simpler ones in design. So I'll find an example script with the com activate company script. And I think I'll start by just sort of quickly going through the flow of a simple process like this that exists in the scripts file and is intended to be run on the server. So in this case, we are calling this script to activate a company. Right at the top, we cover the perform script on server logic, which takes everything that was passed into this, hands it off to the server so that it's not running on the client. Immediately after that, we init the transaction, which is this t variable, which I'll get into in just a moment. After that, we do some validations. Init script variables, these are going to be variables that will be used by this script that we're able to establish right at the top. The find record section is where we pass in the RecID and go to the table that we're looking for and do a find to get to the company. So in this case, we're passing in a company RecID. We find that company on the layout for the company's table, do some more validations, and then this activate company section is really the bulk of what is happening here. So you'll notice we always like to go to a field to establish context first. We open the record. We run this t.eval.fmirror function just to capture any FileMaker errors that may have occurred. And if no errors occurred, if the status is true, then we go in and we make our updates, starting with the company rec status, but then making a number of other changes, activating related records, And finally, we'll go ahead and commit that update if everything went smoothly. Otherwise, if we did encounter any errors, we do a revert. And then finally, we log whatever changes occurred.
And Jeremy's going to be digging into the T function that we're seeing here in a couple of places, not a couple of places, in a bunch of places. He's going to be digging into that in a couple of minutes. But this outline of a script that Jeremy is showing us is standardized across the entire system. So if you scroll back up to the beginning of this section, Jeremy, we've got our find record there at the front or at the top. If you remember last time we talked about how important context is, you're going to see this everywhere. We're always finding the record to make sure we're in the right context. And then that line 45, go to field, has a matching go to field at the end of the process as well. So we're always making sure we're in the right context. We're always making sure we're not accidentally in a field when we start setting fields. Again, I can't reiterate enough how important context is, because as everybody knows, if you've been programming in FileMaker for any period of time, if you're in the wrong context and you start suddenly setting the fields wrong, you get errors, you get bad data. So this particular structure of a script is just sort of something that we've figured out over years and years and years and years of trial and error is the right set of steps. And you might look at it and you might think it's overkill, but every single standard here, every single convention here is the result of something going wrong. So just bear that in mind as you're going through a lot of these scripts, is they are very intentional, and just kind of model everything after this, because it'll just make your life easier.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, we have lots of very particular protocols. And like Brian is saying, really all of these protocols are there for a reason. So I'll just move on from there. And then this last section here is going through and activating the contacts related to the company if necessary. And then finally, we just have the return section where we are going back to the original layout, exiting the script, and returning this T variable.
And that's the return and exit that I referred to last time as well. So obviously these webinars, these seminars are cohesive. So we're going to repeat ourselves, but I don't mind repeating ourselves in some ways. Goes back to the bottom there.
Mm-hmm.
So these activate scripts, these open scripts, these deactivate scripts, whatever may be, that first section that Jeremy first outlined, that's kind of the, I don't know, is that the meat of it? And then the potatoes is the activate context. I'm not sure what the right analogy is here. But that top section from script to script is going to be pretty much the same from module to module. We're going to go to it. We're going to set the record status. We're going to do something. We're going to set some dates. We're going to set some tracking statuses, whatever the requirements are there. And then whatever comes after that are typically module specific. So here, when you're activating the company, we also want to activate any pending context. The order script for opening an order, that's going to be similar in that we're going to set the status and we're going to set some dates and we're going to set some tracking statuses. But then opening an order obviously is very different than activating the company. So as you start to look at the format of some of these scripts, you'll see a lot of things that are very, very similar from script to script, and then things that are very different. That's kind of the purpose of some of these business logic scripts.
Okay. So I think very next thing to get into is the T variable and our T dot custom functions. As is indicated by this comment here, T stands for transaction, and the purpose of it really is to cover the T variable is an array that contains all of the necessary information that is pertinent to the script that is currently being run, what context it's run in, and so on.
Everybody pay careful attention to this, because we've
Yes.
gotten some feedback that it's a little complicated, it's a little complex, it's a little confusing, and it can be if you don't get this explainer from Jeremy. If you're just sort of coming into it with no background, with no context, then it will be a little bit confusing, but Jeremy's going to break it down for us here. So
Yep.
pay attention.
Thank you. So I think probably the best way to start is just I'm going to go to the custom functions and find that t.init custom function. This is what we're calling at the start of essentially every script that we are using t in. And so I'll just sort of go through and cover some of the data that it's storing every time, and then we can go from there. So really, the first thing that T is doing is it's starting with whatever script parameter was passed into this script. So we always use arrays for our script parameters, so that's going to be the starting array that T is sort of inheriting. We do have this comment about removing current session data if it exists. It's just that's something that's not needed, and so we're pulling it out. And then getting the module abbreviation is the next step. So this is the abbreviation that represents the module that this script pertains to. So in the case of activate company, it is for the company's module. And you saw that that script starts with COM. That's the abbreviation for the company's module. And so if a module abbreviation was passed into the script, we would inherit that inside of T. Otherwise, the next thing we would do is look at the RecIDVal parameter. That's a parameter that would commonly be passed into a script. And so if we were passing in the RecIDVal parameter with a company RecID, this custom function would recognize, oh, this is a company RecID, so let's get the module abbreviation COM because this is for the company's module. Otherwise, if the RecIDVal was not passed in, the next thing we would look at is for the script's name. And so just like I mentioned, it would pull it from the script name there and recognize we're in the company's module. This part right here is a case where this function differs between the scripts file and the interface file. Right now we're looking at the scripts file, which pulls it from the script's name, but we also have this note here that says the interface version of this function derives the module abbreviation from the current layout's name. And so just in the same way that we're naming our scripts with the module abbreviation first, we also name our layouts that way. And so it's able to pull that information as well.
And so the first thing that this function is trying to do is, again, establish context. I'm going to beat that dead horse by module. And it's all, like Jeremy pointed out, it starts with that script parameter. But it doesn't always use it. You know, if I'm dependent on that script name, then it's still going to find the right module. So it's sort of like if you pass in a rec ID, then it's going to find it from there. If you don't pass in a record ID, then it'll look for or from a different place. But in any scenario, it's gonna find a module abbreviation rather. And then if it doesn't, well, then it dies and everything breaks. So I don't know, is this going to be too much of a pain to go in and out of this custom function to show a couple of things in that script?
I think I'll just go through the custom function.
Okay, that's
sort of
fair.
top to bottom, and then we can use that knowledge going forward.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's all right. So we've got the module abbreviation figured out at this point. From there, we're able to gather up a bunch of metadata about the module, about the corresponding table, from our modules module, which is something that I suppose I'll touch on. I'll show briefly after this. But essentially, that is a programmers only module where we store a lot of this information, like the name of the table, or the name of the primary key, RecID, and things like that. So right here, we are using getModule attribute that builds an array based on what I was just describing. And then here we split it out. So module RecID field name for the company's module is going to find company RecID. So now we know that that is the field that stores that primary key, RecID. Module label, in this case, is just going to be companies. That's what the module itself is called. We have two module record labels for logging and dialogues and such so that we know what to refer to a single company record or multiple companies as. We can also find the module rec status, which is going to be company rec status. Module table name is the same as the module name. In this case, it's companies. So we get all of that information so that we can reference those fields and that table easily. Going down a little bit further, I mentioned the RecIDVal previously. This section of code recognizes that if no parameter was passed in called RecIDVal, that's okay. If you passed in a parameter called company RecID, and we just determined that that is the module RecID field name, it's going to set RecIDVal with company RecID, and with that value that was passed in. So that's pretty cool. Another important thing we're doing is that T always stores the status and result of the script. So by default, we set status to true, meaning everything is going fine, and we set result to blank. I'll point out some examples later on, but for if an error occurs or if a validation fails in one of our processes, we have the ability to set the result with an error message and set the status to false, which tells the script to essentially skip over everything that remains so that it can get to returning that error message. We're also keeping track of the start time, just in case we want to reference that sort of thing. And a couple of other things like action and action for messages. In the case of the activate company script, we're passing in an action of activate. And so this will tell it when we generate a log entry to say this user activated this company. And then the last thing we're doing in this function is we're taking this whole T array that we have just established and splitting it, running it through this a.split custom function. What that means is it takes every parameter within the array and establishes it as its own variable. So instead of two ways that if we wanted to reference the company RecID that was stored in T, we could either get it from the array that is stored in T, or we could reference the newly created variable just called company RecID. And that applies to everything in the array.
Yeah, so once we initiate T at the very top of the script, you now have access to a whole host of data points about that module. And you can leverage some of the more generically named variables like Jeremy just said. Like you could refer to the variable company RecID, or you could refer to the variable RecIDVal. But by using the more generic version of that, you can start doing some more universal scripting, some more less context specific. And I think we're going to be getting into that more so in the interface file in a couple of seminars from here, if I remember the outline. But you'll see a lot of that generic use of some of these variables at that point. But just a little bit more info on that a.split is, T comes out of this as an array. So A equals B, C equals D, E equals F. What this is going to do is it's going to give you an array or a set of variables. So variable A has the value of B, variable C has the value of D, variable E has the value of F. So variable RecIDVal has the value COM 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Does that make sense? I'm going to open that up to attendees to see if anybody has any questions on that, but that might be one if you're not familiar with, you might need to stew over a little bit and then play with it on your own. You'll step through the code and you'll get to that t.init, and you'll just sort of see a bunch of variables crack open in your data viewer. So that's a fun one to play with.
With that,
I think let's see. So Doug just asks, we might want to reiterate that it splits the script parameter as well. Yep, that is an accurate statement. So that
Yes.
T variable is obviously going to pull a bunch of information from the module. So you've got your module name and your module label and your RecIDVal and stuff. But if you passed in any number of parameters that a specific script accepts, it's also going to split out those as well. I don't know, do we have one handy to show? Maybe one that's got a lot. What about like go into like GJ? I think that one's got some variables that are fun to look at.
A GJ script.
Yeah, so even here in the first one, obviously get GJ entry rec ID, you'll pass in the GJ entry ID, but you can also pass in GJ entry rec status. I can't recall exactly what that's doing or why, but that T dot init is also going to give you a variable called GJ entry ID and GJ entry rec status. The next one is another good one. So if you pass in a variable called for reversal as part of your array, you're going to get a variable called for reversal that's split out in your data viewer.
Right.
Cool.
All
Did you
right.
want to show that module really quick?
Oh, yes. Thank you. So from the aACE menu, if I go into System Admin and then into Developer, this is the modules module. You can see we have a record for each module in aACE. If I click into companies, like I was talking about earlier, you can see this is where we store the module name, record labels. We have nice little examples over here of what kind of data is supposed to be stored in there. Got the table name, the data type, which is used for our data migration process, as well as what the rec ID, abbreviation, name, rec status fields, what all of those are.
Can you go into, maybe go to order items? What order items is obviously going to have a parent rec ID. That's going to be your order rec ID.
Mhm.
Just want to kind of show a couple of examples.
Yeah.
So not every single field is required for every single record because it's all contingent on what the data type is. Obviously, in this case, the item itself doesn't have an abbreviation or an ID there on the left, but it does have a parent. Orders is going to have an ID, but it's not going to have a parent, or does it? It's probably project. No, so it's not technically the parent, which is fine.
Yeah.
Can you go into edit mode and show that data type dropdown so we can kind of point that out as well? You mentioned that this is part of, this is important for data migration, which is true, but we do have different data types here for each table: transaction, transaction item, transaction details, basically the level below item, which would be something like, is order procurement and transaction detail? I can't remember. But then master item, so companies, contacts, and then just set up or not applicable. So there are a handful of options here. And I don't think let me add an item to our miscellaneous webinar at the very end. It might be worth touching on that reset process because especially as you're doing development before go live, people are going to want to know how to reset the system and they're going to want to know how to get that set up, as they're doing testing and handing it off to their own clients. That's probably a good thing to cover.
Yeah,
So
that
I
sounds
added
good.
that to our miscellaneous topics.
Cool. Thank you.
There's one more thing I wanted to point out here, which was, so the modules module also contains records for things that aren't technically modules. Like we don't necessarily have a module for line item code vendors, but it is a table in the system. And so that is because, we have scripts, we have tables, and we've got logic for line item code vendors. And so to get that T function to pull the right information, the right data points, we have a module for it. It might be more accurate to call this the tables module, but that wouldn't be any less confusing. So I don't know. but this is probably this is equally reflective of the different modules in the system as it is of the tables. So I bring that up because if you are creating custom tables, which happens quite frequently, if you're creating a custom table and you want to leverage that T function, you can go in here and create a record for it and give it the table name and give it the module label and give it the ID and the parent and everything. And then it can just sort of fall in line with all of the things that Jeremy just showed you.
Going on from there, I'd like to touch on just some of the other custom functions that we use to interact with T throughout scripts. So I figure I can just sort of go through this. Oh, I'll go back to companies. Go through here and just point some of them out. So t.validate.parameter, we have a bunch of functions like this that are used for validating, confirming that a parameter of that name with a valid value was passed into the script. In the case of this .module RecID one, that is looking at the current module's RecID. So we pass in company RecID, and this validates that company RecID was passed in. And if it was, then the script proceeds as normal. And if that parameter was not passed into the script, like I mentioned before, status is set to false, and result is set with an error message indicating as much. You will notice that almost every section of code in our scripts is wrapped in t.getStatus.isTrue. That is confirming that the status stored within T is still true. If it is false for any reason, we don't want to run through and continue running this code in the script. We want to skip over those sections so that we can get to the end and then return the result.
And to reiterate that, Jeremy, it's like 99.99999% of the sections are wrapped in the t.get is true, like you said, to make sure that we're not doing anything that shouldn't be done. The 0.00001% where it's something that we want to trigger whether or not the script is true or false, those get comments. It's like, this is not using t.is true because of X, Y, or Z, because we want to send a notice whether or not it was a success or a failure. So there are a handful of very key places in certain scripts where we do where we don't use t.get status is true, but that's intentional and it should be commented with an explanation of why we're doing that.
Yes. Next one I'll point to is this t.eval.find. This one we always run after running the unif find record script, which just will set an error if we were unable to find a record based on the RecID that was passed in. So if we're looking for a company with the RecID COM12345, we go to that layout, we do the find, and we find no record. Come back out here, t.eval.find is going to set the status to false because we are not in the right context, we know.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've said, okay, I want to update this record. The record ID is Acme Educational Inc. Oops, I passed in the name and not the rec ID. Imagine if I didn't capture for that error that it couldn't find the right record based on whatever bogus rec ID I threw in there. And now all of a sudden it's updating data on the first record in the system. That's not good. So we'll say it a million more times, I'm sure, but context is important.
Yes. Next, most all of our modules have their own validate scripts where we're running through and validating for a particular action that we're trying to perform. So t.eval.validate will accept the result from that validate script and update T status and result accordingly. Another one to point out is this t.eval.fm error that specifically looks at the last FileMaker error that occurred. And so if we for example, we're on the company, we are trying to open the record, but another user is already locking up this record. That kicks back a FileMaker error, and then this custom function here will recognize that, set the status to false, and put together a nice error message based on what FileMaker error occurred. Also, I'm going to close modules module so that I'm not getting those tooltips. And that looks like most of the T functions that are just commonly used in a script like this. So that covers those ones. If I open up the custom functions dialog here and go to T, you'll see we have quite a lot of these for all kinds of different purposes. Like I mentioned, there are a lot of t.validate functions, but we use these in lots of different places. I think I can cover these at a later
A lot of them are
date as they come up.
self-explanatory.
Yeah.
I was going to say, as they come up, we can explain them, but a
Mhm.
lot of them are pretty self-explanatory that if you kind of know how one works, you know how they all work.
Mhm.
We'll spend the rest of the day on that alone if we want
Right.
to.
Right. So rather than delve further into the T functions, I'd like to cover some of the custom functions that are frequently used that are not relating to T. So if I just go back up to the top, first set of custom functions that I'll cover here are the a dot functions. In this case, the A is for array. aACE does utilize JSON arrays. And so if you look into a function like a.set, you'll notice that ultimately what we're doing is using JSON set element to add a parameter to an array. Very similarly, our a.get function is using JSON get element to pull a value out of an array. And so these will accept the array itself, usually stored in a variable, and then the attribute name that you're looking for. And in the case of a.set, it accepts both of those parameters as well as the value that you want to set the attribute with. We already touched on a.split. And so that's essentially what those are, just interacting with JSON arrays in aACE. That's what these are
Just
for.
one more thing about that a.set is it accepts the value or the field ref. That lets us, if you use that and you set the array with a field, then it's going to grab the name and make that the attribute name, and then it's going to grab the value and make that the value. So that's just a little shortcut for not having to set the attribute name with the field name. It'll just happen automatically. And you'll see that around if you're looking for it.
Yes. Going further down, I'll find the loop custom functions, because there are only a small handful of these, but these are very, very helpful. We do lots of loops in our scripting. And so these are what we use to handle those. We have the loop.init, which we set at the start of each loop, which is where we establish the number of whether that's a record number or portal row number that we're starting from, and then the stopping number, at which point we'll end the loop. At any point while you're looping through, after we've run that loop.init, you can use loop.index to get the current iteration, the current number that we're on, or loop.getStopIndex to get that iStop value that we had previously established. And then the purpose of loop.next is for incrementing the current loop number until we reach iStop, at which point we exit the loop. And
This set of function, oh, do you have, I wonder if we can't show that really quickly.
yeah,
That's a little
what
bit
I was
easier
just
to
thinking.
digest. You've got
Yeah,
company
so right
activate,
here.
scroll down. There you go.
Yeah. Right, so here we are deciding we want to activate the related linked company record. So right at the top, init loop variables is using loop.init to start from 1, and then the iStop, the ending point for the loop, is going to be the sum of resource 1 for linked companies. That's going to be the count of related linked company records. I'll
So
touch
if
on
there are
this
10 related
I.
records, I is 1, iStop is 10.
Right,
Sorry, go ahead,
exactly.
Julie.
And then this I here, so this is sort of a convention that we have for naming each set of loop variables. I is always the first that we use, but in the event that we have nested loops, the first one is I, the second will be N, and then the third will be R. And so the key word for remembering that is just the word inner, I, then N, then R, for nested loops. So after we have done this loop.init, we actually start the loop. You can see we're going to an object that is the portal that we're looking at. And then we have a go to portal row step using loop.index. We're referencing I because we're looking at the I loop specifically. And so at the beginning, this is going to be 1. So we go to portal row 1. On the next increment, that'll be 2. And we go to portal row 2 and so on. And then, like I said, we have the exit loop if step calling loop.next. So this is what is incrementing that I value. And then as soon as we hit the stopping point of, in the example, 10, then we exit out of that loop.
And a lot of people will be like, why aren't you just doing a script step that says I plus 1, I plus 1, I plus 1? We used to do that. A lot of FileMaker programmers do it. But this loop.next function is actually really cool. It simplifies it. You know, it basically does your I plus 1 for you, and it does your exit for you, because it can't count the number of times we've forgotten an I plus 1, and then we get stuck in an infinite loop.
Another interesting thing about these functions and the loop.next specifically is when you are initting the loop, you can specify these numbers in reverse order. So let's say we wanted to loop through this portal, but we really want to start from the bottom row and work our way up. We could put the sum of resource 1 into this first parameter, and then put the number 1 into the next parameter. That would tell it start from 10 and end at 1. If you establish the I loop that way, then loop.next is going to say I minus 1 until it gets to 1 and then exits. All right, so I think that covers loops. So let
While
me
we're
go
there,
back.
I mean, Jeremy, do you want
Yeah.
to point out, this is another one of those conventions you'll think we're overkill. Line 73 and line 92 are both go-to field. Again, we want to make sure that we're not accidentally in a field before we start evaluating loops. And then at the end of it, we want to make sure we're not accidentally in a field before we keep going. So that's another convention we'll see everywhere. Before and after a
Yes.
loop, we're going to have a go-to field.
Right. Because not having that go-to field step has caught us and caused problems in the past. So we made it our convention just to make sure that we are always in the right context, no matter what.
And if you think we're crazy, you're probably right, but it saved so many problems.
Yes, we have good reasons for all of our protocols, as I was mentioning earlier. So going back to custom functions, the next set that I'd like to touch on are the LOV dot custom functions. LOV stands for list of values, and so this is all of these functions are used for interacting with lists of values. That's specifically text values that are delimited by return characters. And so you'll see LOV.addValue in a lot of places, which accepts one parameter, that is the list of values, and then another parameter that is the value to add. It will take your value to add and put it at the bottom of your specified list. And we have some nice handling in there for dealing with additional unwanted return characters and trimming the values before we put them in and things like that. So this is really quite handy.
And it takes account of like, empty rows. It's not, if your value to add is blank, then it's not going to add a blank row, which is really nice. I mean, a lot of these LOV functions, you think they're kind of basic, and a lot of them are, but they just make things so much easier and clearer. So something like, what's my favorite? Let's see. My favorite is LOV value is not present in list and LOV value is present in list, because I can't tell you how many times I would have a list of things and I'm like, I wonder if I'm already in there, or I wonder if I'm not already in there, because you can have different branching logic depending on whether something's already been accounted for or whether it hasn't been accounted for. And so in aACE5 or aACE4, I would just always be doing like filter values or pattern counts and things like that. Just, again, opportunity for error, but having that custom function there just makes my life a whole lot easier. Other handy LOV functions here are like the get list index. Would be if you've got a list of values and you want to know where in that list a particular value exists. So A, B, C, D, E. Where does C live? It's number 3. So that's what that function does. That's a really handy one as well.
Mm-hmm. And then we use LOV.return unique values quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
That will take your list of values, and if there are multiple instances of the same value, it will trim out and dedupe those additional instances. I also mentioned that a list of values in aACE is text values delimited by return characters. So we do have these convert functions. So we could say convert list of values to text string, and you can specify a custom delimiter in place of a return character. So if I typed in comma space, we'd have a single text string that lists them out delimited by commas. And then same thing for converting a text string to list of values. Those are nice as well.
Yeah, and how many times have you done a substitute on a list of values and you say substitute list of values, comma, and you just get a comma at the very end? You don't want that. So the function will accommodate that as well.
Yes. So I think that's it for the list of values functions. We'll really quick touch on the num.formatAs functions. We use these when dealing with really any of our number fields or values. The main ones that you'll see used often are format as quantity, format as total, or format as unit rate. And so the idea here being is that a quantity is generally not going to have any decimal places unless a value with decimal places was already specified, whereas format as total is intended for monetary values, and so those are going to be 2 decimal places. Then a unit rate is, as it sounds, a unit rate that would be multiplied by a quantity. And so by default, these values can have anywhere between 2 and 6 decimal places, although that is something that you can customize if your particular system needs unit rates that are shorter or longer than that. And then I want to talk about the paramname and value functions. So we've taken a lot of steps in developing aACE to reduce room for programmer error in lots of places. And one of the ways that we've done that is having these paramname functions. So if we've got a parameter that we are frequently setting or referring to inside of arrays or different variables and such, we'll have a custom function like, let's say, success RecIDs. And this custom function is purely hard coding that success RecID's parameter name. We like doing this much more than actually having a bunch of different instances of a hard-coded name. Like I mentioned before, to reduce programmer error by way of typos and such. But it also supports cascades further down the line. If we later decide that we don't want this to be called success RecIDs, but we want to change its name in some way, now we only have to change it in this custom function, and all of our scripts that reference it are now referencing that new parameter name. So we use those, and then very similarly are our value custom functions. In which case, if I look at value.email, you can see it's just hard coding the word email. Or if I look at, let's see, not applicable, that's also a value that is hard coded here in the custom function so that it doesn't need to be hard coded in many places. You'll also notice a couple of these have these little categories like rectype. Value.rectype.outgoing would be used for the outgoing shipment rectype, right? Or value.status.inactive is for the rec status inactive. So it's a simple concept, but we just have found this to be very helpful for the reasons I've already mentioned.
And then there's a kind of a third category of this if you go up to the value.is email.
Mhm.
So now I've got a function called value.email, which is just an email. Now I have a function that evaluates whether a value is email or not. This is going to seem a little bit redundant, but if you're going through the scripts and you're saying, okay, well, over and over again, I'm trying to evaluate whether the value is email or mail, and this comes up with our email processes. You know, are we sending this by email or are we sending it in a different method? If I can say value is email, pass in a variable or a field name, then all of a sudden everything is consistent. I have typed email just 2 times instead of an infinity number of times, and that just, like Jeremy said, this reduces the errors that are introduced with typos. You know, you start looking at the script for hours and hours and days trying to figure out how to get it to work. In the context of 100 other things, your eyes might get blurry, and this just sort of reduces the likelihood of introducing errors like that. Obviously, we can say field, whatever the field name is, this email, but then again, if I miss an M or I miss an L, or I and L sometimes look the same when they're right next to each other. So turn it into a custom function. These are the ones that we've created for ourselves, but I would advise you to do it for your own custom functions or your own custom feature sets, because you know, our thinking, or I guess our rule of thumb is if I'm doing something like value is whatever more than 3 times, then I'm just going to turn it into a custom function. Just because if I'm using it 3 times, I'm probably going to use it more than that. And it's super easy to create these custom functions that we might as well, just to, again, reduce error among yourself and then your other programmers when you bring them in. It just makes things consistent across programmers.
And then I will very briefly touch on our SQL functions here. Really just to talk about how we do use SQL in aACE to perform queries to get data, sometimes without having to go to the context of another table, perform a find, and get the value. bring it back. We can use a SQL query to get that data a little bit more simply. But it is important to note that we've learned from experience that SQL queries can be very fast when you're querying on a table that has very few records, or that is likely to have few records. But as soon as we have tables that may grow to be larger and have thousands or hundreds of thousands of records, then SQL queries tend to take a much longer time than it would take just to look through a FileMaker relationship or to do a find and get that data. So that is just sort of an important note on that. But you will see we use our SQL.SimpleSelect in a handful of places to get values using SQL queries. And so with that, I'd like to go to our customization style guide. So if I just search customization, this is actually right up here at the top of the scripts workspace. This is our style guide that defines sort of our rules for customizing scripts in a particular aACE system, and how we note and mark everything that has been customized. We've got this note right up at the top that says throughout the script, ABBR, stands for abbreviation, is used in place of the aACE customer's abbreviation. So when you have a system set up for a particular customer and you've got an abbreviation associated with that customer, that is the abbreviation you'll be using. But for now, we have this ABBR here. And then we also have a to-do noted at the top of the guide. It says to find the custom function called abbr.doCustom and rename it to use the aACE customer's abbreviation. I'll go ahead and pull that up here. So right here, you can see this is the custom function, and its value is just true. That is to say that we are enabling custom function customizations in the scripts where we're referencing it. So if I was doing this for our aegis, I might rename this to aegis.doCustom, just as an example. But I'll cancel that. This function does exist in the interface, scripts, and data files. And so one of the first things you want to do before you start customizing is rename that function in each of those files. And so I looked over this. I think I'll give a brief stepping through of this, but the notes that we have in here in this customization style guide are fairly thorough and well explained.
If you want, I can explain the purpose of that function.
Yes, that would be helpful.
So the purpose of that function is to clearly identify any script or even data change or interface that has been changed from core aACE. So if you modify a script, then you can introduce your custom logic in between this if statement that just identifies it as being custom. There are several reasons for this. One is if ever we needed to re-customize the system, we can run it through a perception or an inspector, and we can zero in on that function and know exactly where any customization has been done. So that would be in the event of, say, re-customization if you're going from 6 to 7 or from 5 to 6, or even we'll occasionally redeploy a system, 6 months after go live. If there's not a tremendous amount of customization, we'll just re-customize a new version of the system to get maintenance underway, or rather get them up to date on maintenance. The other purpose, that's the main purpose of it, but here the commenting makes it a lot easier to see. So you've got this, like, what is that, 10 slashes followed by the abbreviation?
20.
20. So that when you're scrolling through a script, for example, jumps out at you. Originally, we went from 5 aACE 5 had only the commenting. In aACE 6, we were only going to do the function, and we realized we liked both because if you're scrolling through a script, that comment of 20 slashes and the customer abbreviation in all caps really jumps out at you. Because when we are applying a maintenance patch, we might replace a script, and that's just going to get rid of any bugs that might have been introduced. But we don't want to do that if there's customization in there. So being able to clearly identify where the customization has or has not been done allows us to apply maintenance patches a lot more reliably and reduce programmer error. So those are kind of the two main purposes of that. Is there anything else I didn't that you can think of, Jeremy?
No, that covers it. I just
There's
would just
also
say,
there's also a clever use. You see, we've got 21 is if abbreviation do custom. It's using that custom function, and then else the out of the box code goes there. So technically, you can actually turn off customization in a system by updating that custom function. So by default, it's just true, meaning anything tagged with that custom function is going to be part of that if statement. But if for whatever reason you wanted to switch off customization, you just turn that to false and all of the out of the box logic starts to kick in. So that's a cool use of maybe deploying conditional customization perhaps. But that has come up once or twice before where we just kind of want to turn on customization or turn off customization. And the function is just true. You can do whatever you want there. Maybe you want to have is programmer equals false and then true for everything else. And then if you're a programmer, then it branches in one way. And if you're not a programmer, it branches in another. Like, be creative with it if you need to, but that's sort of the essential functionality of that function as well as the commenting.
and then I was just going to sort of reiterate that with this method of tagging your custom code makes it easy to see. That does also mean that if you make customizations to a script and don't tag it this way, and then we come in at a future date to implement a maintenance patch, there is a likelihood that your customization will be overwritten.
So there's
if
a
we are replacing
guarantee. If you've got
so
like a
please do
little bit
be
of customization on line 976 of a 10,000 line script, like we're not going to see that, but we'll scroll through and see anything tagged like that. We also require any logging of customization to be at the top of the script. So if we do come in and apply a maintenance patch, the first thing we're going to do is go look at that edit log at the top of the script. And if there are anything tagged as custom, then we'll say, okay, cool, there's customization in the script. I need to find it and make sure that I don't overwrite it on accident. And if there are any questions, obviously we would reach out to you, or you can apply your own maintenance patches, depending on what the relationship is at that point. But yeah, tag your customization.
Yes. And then also, I guess I'll just encourage you to go in and read through this customization style guide before actually doing any customization, because I don't want to go through all of it in this meeting. But if you are creating an entirely custom script, we have you take these two steps and place them up at the top. Just saying this entire script is custom, and it's also referencing that do custom function so that we can search for it and find those easily.
I guess I should also point out, and I think we're going to talk about this in the next webinar and the one after that, is in aACE 5, we told you to put that abbreviation in the script name so that we knew if a script was customized. Don't do that anymore because a lot of the scripting in aACE 6 is dynamic. So tag it this way, not in the script name, and we'll cover that again when we get there.
Yes. Yeah, but aACE 6 does utilize perform script by name pretty heavily, so that's why. Yep.
Okay, we're about to go over, so I think the last thing I want to chat about. All right, we got a question from Doug. Do we still need to update this script with the scripts that we edited? Yes, please. So down at the bottom, I think, Jeremy, there's a list of customized scripts. That makes it easy to know what scripts have been customized. The last thing I want to touch on, we're already over, so I'll do it quickly. Jeremy, can you go to the top of any script where we initiate PSOS?
Yes.
Which is basically any script.
Mhm.
So A6 is fast in part because we're offloading a lot of the processing to the server. Obviously, if you do that, then it's hard to step through script debugger in the event there is an issue with the code. You can turn off PSOS from the menu. So just do, what is that command? There you go. You can toggle PSOS on or off, and that'll be system-wide. So
Yes.
disable it, enable it, and then it'll skip that branch and allow you to step through the code. The other method is to add a bullet point to the front of a script. Right? Doesn't that work?
Oh, the bullet point in front of the script. Yes.
Yeah, so if you add a bullet point to the front of a script, then PSOS is disabled for that particular script. That's handy just because if you know you're working on a specific process and you want to zero in on that, but don't necessarily want to slow down the rest of the workflow in order to get to that point, you can just zero in on that one script and step through it. And I'll say this many, many times over the course of the seminar, is that script debugger is your friend. Most of our scripts have a breakpoint at the top of the script, and we try to make sure that there are not breakpoints anywhere else in the script. So you'll notice that we do a lot of handoffs and from file to file, from script to subscript to other subscript, and then maybe another subscript, and then coming all the way back. So it might sometimes be hard to figure out where exactly you are in process. So script debugger is your friend, and then the call stack is your friend to know exactly where in the overall process you are. I apologize for going over. Does anybody have any questions before we wrap up? If you want to stew on anything and let us know, send in a support ticket, and we will cover that during the next seminar. Did I step on your toes at all, Jeremy? All right, cool.
That's good.
So I think we'll wrap up, and thank you for joining, and we will see you all next week.
All right, I'll take us out.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so if you missed out on the first ACU seminar, please visit our website, showme.asof.net, where you can browse our library of previously recorded webinars and seminars. So that's all for today. I'd like to thank all of you for attending and sharing your questions during the presentation. You will get a link to this recording so that you can watch it again or share it with colleagues who couldn't join us today. If you think of any questions we didn't cover, as Brian mentioned, you can always reach out to us at support@asof.com, and we'll be happy to get you an answer. You can also sign up for future webinars at ACE and ACU seminars at asof.com/webinars. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week. We'll see you next time.